What we're going to be looking at is a bit of the meso level of, on the business level, how is it exactly that we are going to be implementing post-growth into our businesses. Now, the first comment that I want to make is that oftentimes people think with social enterprise in general that it needs to be supported by things like subsidies and tax breaks in order to have a stimulus for it to take off. We aspire actually to avoid all that, and what we're trying to do is we are trying to colonize the sort of the commercial monetized economy and divert cash streams basically from this commercial economy into a parallel, more social, or as it were, post-growth economy. It is not the kind of thing where it's going to be global domination, you know, or how we need to like run the commercial economy into the ground. It's absolutely nothing like that, like this. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not that, you know, we have to win and they have to lose, but rather we have to understand that the commercial economy is going to be our ally in building the post-growth economy, and it must be so because the majority of people in the world, of course, are participating in the commercial economy, and thus we need them to get on board. You know, what this basically means is we also have to keep in mind that, remember, I mean, the 99% of people are are part of the 99%, and thus it's also in their best interest to cooperate with building a parallel, less extractive economy. So despite the fact actually that the majority of people are part of the commercial economy, they will actually be sympathetic to our cause of building a more social, less extractive economy, which is why I believe that we will be able to count on cooperation. And we need to see it as less of a fight and sort of more as a kind of transition in partnership with the other side. So, you know, and this brings us to the topic of social procurement. As a business, we're dealing quite frequently with procurement officers who implement procurement policies in which they make purchasing decisions about exactly which vendors they want to buy from and what the criteria are for these vendors so we can select them in order to buy from them. Now, you can make very small tweaks to procurement policy by adding social procurement, well, you know, adding social enterprise or less extractiveness or perhaps climate or sustainability criteria or things like diversity, you know. I mean, there's a number of different factors that you can implement into your procurement criteria to try and create the market that then it influences the vendors to actually change what the products that they're offering. Even like small tweaks, things like saying in our procurement of a particular software package, we prefer if it's open source, right? You know, the companies and multinationals and governments and other organizations who are making these procurement decisions, they are creating the market. You know, by the requests for proposals and other, requests that they're putting out there. And it is precisely what they are asking for that is what the market is going to provide. So really just making these small tweaks in procurement policies can have very large ripple effects. The European Commission actually also has templates of things like social procurement policies. This is not necessarily a new idea, but it is one that is spreading, is not as widespread as it should be. But we do need to understand in procuring that just going for the cheapest vendor, or even, that will not necessarily always create the society, that you actually want. So, and that brings us to a related topic that I like to call social compliance. Now, this is a term that I would say people speak about considerably less. If you think about compliance, compliance oftentimes drives business and procurement decisions, right? Because with compliance officers, I mean, really what they are trying to do is they are trying to ensure that we are meeting our legal requirements, to ensure, again, compliance with a set of rules or with a set of laws or just best practices, and this could be anything from data privacy and protection laws to, I mean, if you have banks, of course, so they have special laws, and medical institutions like hospitals, of course, also have special laws. But the thing is, oftentimes fear is driving the behavior of compliance officers, right? And with compliance, there's that usual quote of, nobody got fired for buying from IBM, right? Sadly, that does dictate oftentimes the behavior of these compliance officers in guiding, how we're going to act, how we're going to behave, how we're going to structure our business, and also who we're going to buy from. But the problem is that just taking the safe road, right, and just meeting the minimum standards, and ticking check boxes, that is not, of course, sufficient to really getting where we need to go. And what I think auditors as well as compliance officers can understand is what we're actually really trying to do here is we're actually trying to make the most meaningful positive change. Because truthfully speaking, most laws are there to protect people, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing where, most of the times when politicians make laws, it's either to protect individuals, protect society, protect the environment, or generally keep things working fairly and amicably between people. In a sense, it's actually not all that different from if you consider religion, and things, I would say like source texts like the Bible, for example, you have text, right? And that text is basically the law, right? But then it's just words, right? But then what you have is biblical experts who then have different interpretations of that text, right? And the one Bible expert is going to say, well, actually, but I think the priority here that we need to pay the most attention to is you shall love your neighbor like yourself, right? And then another expert on the Bible will then say, yes, but actually I think that the Bible's saying that a man shall not lay with another man is far more important, right? And the point is, look, same source text, different interpretations, radically different outcomes, just quite simply because of how different people are emphasizing different parts of it. And also these interpretations oftentimes may conflict with one another, right? So what's happening here then is that you've got the law, you've got the text, but then you've also got like fences around the law, right? And you're basically at that point, these religious experts are telling their followers that they need to stay within the bounds of the fences, right? And they define themselves what those fences might be. Now it's the same thing actually with compliance. Right? Because you've got the laws, and these could include things like GDPR, right? And then you've got the interpretation of the law. And at that point, that is really those fences and those safeguards that, in this particular case, the auditor or the compliance officer is saying, well, okay, that's the text, but this is sort of the fence that I'm going to give you to stay within to try and ensure that we're actually doing the right thing. But what this means is that how we draw up that fence can differ. It's actually completely subjective. So what that means is, our interpretation is up to us. And think about it. Most of the times with auditors and compliance people, it's a very conservative, fear-driven culture. But what would happen if you took a group of art students and then dropped them into a compliance department? Not really. And the point is, you take people who are used to looking at the world from a different way, from a more holistic perspective with meaning more up at the front. How would they interpret compliance differently? And these are the things that we need to think about. Compliance officers could be the new superheroes, and they can make a whole lot of meaningful change. but that would involve their understanding that this is a position that they can occupy and then feeling motivated to do so. Another topic that I think is important is about ethical supply chains. Because if you're attempting to procure things that are better, that assumes that these things that are better are available, right? And on top of that, when you're trying to create these products or services that are better, it also assumes that they have suppliers underneath them that then can work together to produce this, this better, more ethical, more fair product or service. But it turns out actually that ethical supply chains are really, really tricky. So I would like to give you one example, actually two examples, local homegrown Amsterdam-based companies that I think have far exceeded the bounds of Amsterdam and the Netherlands since then. But I would like to start with Fairphone. So Fairphone is a really great company, and they make a really great product. They actually started as an art project, oddly enough, from the Waag Society. So the company really started with Bas van Abel, Tessa Wierink, also a few people from the Waag, including Marleen Sticker. And really their whole idea at the beginning was to really shine a light from an artistic perspective on the conflict minerals and metals that were being extracted from Africa to make these components in these cell phones. You know, they started by visiting these locations, but ultimately they thought, well, what better way to be able to really shine a light on the problem than to try making our own phone that actually tries sourcing components more responsibly. Absolutely wonderful idea. So within the bounds of their fab lab that they had at the Waag, they built the initial prototypes of the Fairphone. What then happened is they went to find an impact VC because the phone was actually quite successful and they wanted to be able to scale the idea. Another thing that they did is they started a crowdfunding campaign. So they went to the large telco providers, things like KPN, some of the others, and they raised a whole bunch of crowdfunding. So then what wound up happening is that the CEO, Bas van Abel, he now was sitting on this tremendously huge pot of money, and now he was like, oh man, now I need to deliver this thing, right? So what did he do? Well, he went to Shenzhen in China because he said, well, in Shenzhen, they know how to make cell phones. So he went to Shenzhen and he basically asked himself the question of which providers, which vendors he would need to partner with to produce the most fair possible cell phone. Now, let's say, hypothetically speaking, that a cell phone has roughly 400 different components. Okay? What this means is that he basically would have needed to go find the 400 most fair suppliers for each of these components, and then go up to each of those suppliers and then say, would you please be fair, right? And then at that point, he went back home again. They assembled the Fairphone. Of course, it was a very large success. I mean, the phone was beautiful. It worked really well. And on top of that, of course, it was a very good story. There was only one small problem. Bas went 2 years later back to Shenzhen and went and checked up upon the suppliers that he had contracted in for some of the parts in the cell phone. And he found out, lo and behold, that not all of the practices that these vendors were using were fair. This for him really led to a bit of a crisis. He was incredibly under pressure to deliver this fair product that he was delivering, and there was a bit of discontent also amongst the employees within Fairphone that were basically saying, look, but we want to actually, be a product with a story, and not just like a story with some product. So what happened then is, Bas had discovered firsthand that it is really, really difficult, if not almost impossible, to architect completely fair supply chains from the top down. Right? A similar example of this, also, again, famous Amsterdam company, is Tony Chocolonely. Same thing. Same dilemma, right? Because also Tony's, which has extremely good chocolate, which I'm sure I eat too much of, they also started similarly as an art project. In other words, as a TV show. There's a Dutch TV show that's called Keuringsdienst der Waarde, which I think in English means something along the lines of Inspectors of Value. And they had done an episode on chocolates and the fact that there was child slave labor being used in the chocolate. Same thing. Basically, Toon, who was basically the Tonys, from the brand, he decided he wanted to start a 100% child slave labor free chocolate bar. And then he, again, went to those places in Africa, tried and set things up with child slave labor free. Same thing. Could you please not use child slaves? Thanks. And same thing. Went back later. Turns out that these child slaves were still being used. And it's because these vendors had commercial pressures that they too were, So same kind of a problem. I mean, architecting these ethical supply chains from the top down is really hard. And this is also part of the reason why Tony's at a certain point had actually modified their packaging, not to say 100% child slave labor free chocolate, but to say on the way to 100% child slave labor free chocolate, right? Now, look, I mean, the point is that I'm not trying to say that Fairphones and Tony's are not great companies, and I'm also not trying to claim that that the founders didn't do the absolute best possible job that they could have. But I think the real question is, how can we actually do things differently? If we can't architect ethical supply chains from the top down, then what's the alternative way to do it? Well, maybe you can do it from the bottom up. So let's take our example of a Fairphone. Okay, a Fairphone is pretty complicated, right? Because, 400 components in a Fairphone, that's an awful lot. What happens if we use reductionistic engineering logic to take the problem and break it down into smaller problems? Okay, so let's say that one out of the 400 parts in a Fairphone is an LED, right? Can we make a fair LED? If you think about that, that might already be difficult. Because, what is an LED actually? An LED is glass, metal, a diode. Okay, let's take that problem of a fair LED and break that down again. Can we make a fair diode? But you sort of see what I mean. Now, let's say, hypothetically speaking, you were able to break the problem down enough, and let's say that perhaps with the glass in the diode, you knew someone who was able to make glass that was fair, right? Then at that point, you would have, you're still a really far way away from the Fairphone, right? You've got some fair glass, that's it. However, the point is, now you can make 1/400th, roughly, of every phone fair. And that's actually the different approach that you can take. And then once you actually have this fair glass or fair metal or a fair diode, if you had a fair diode, for example, it's not just 1/400th of a fair phone you have now. You could also make 1/100th of a fair Fitbit or 1/10th of a fair bike light. The point is, you can take that component and start integrating it into everything. And then you can start basically putting that ethics by design into different parts of the supply chain then from the bottom up. So, but then let's go back to Fairphone. I don't mean to imply here in what I'm telling you that Fairphone has failed. In fact, at a certain point, Fairphone themselves also figured out the problems with this approach, and they themselves wanted to work on more bottom-up approaches. So one thing that Fairphone did is they created a coalition with other companies to try and source ethical components. And what they did is they started with things like gold and tungsten and cobalt. So they are a small player in the market, Fairphone, but they were able to partner with companies like Glencore, Signify, as well as Tesla. And they opened a fair tungsten mine in which they were basically mining this child slave labor free tungsten. It turns out also that tungsten is useful for solar panels, and Elon Musk and Tesla actually found this quite useful because they didn't want child slave labor in their solar panels either. And then by banding together and building these coalitions of different companies, they were able to get enough volume to be able to start this fair tungsten mine. Similar story also with gold. They also partnered with some other companies to produce a fair gold mine, and they were, I believe, routing some of that gold to their factory in, I think it was in Switzerland, and via there, I believe iPhone and Apple actually had used some of the gold from Fairphone's operations in Europe. Which meant that even without knowing it, the iPhone had a very small amount of fair trade gold in its product as well. So, yeah, so this is really quite a powerful approach. And what Fairphone was actually doing here is they were combining their position as a large purchaser of these components to basically try and build that fair supply chain, both from the top down as well as from the bottom up. So this is good food for thought. Another thing that we, I think, need to realize is that we can start with this ethics by design. We spoke about this in a previous class. And we don't necessarily need to build companies that are huge, or even companies that need to do more than one thing. We can build companies that are small and that do one thing, do it well, do it with ethics, and do it with integrity. And then what we can do is take those ethical by design companies, non-extractive companies, and then we can actually form interconnected networks of these companies so they too can form these supply chains of increasingly complex products from the bottom up. And that is then how you start to get entire supply chains and entire more complex products that have complete ethics by design. Now, the whole idea of taking simple atomic, components and then interconnecting them, this is not a new idea, right? I mean, of course, the most obvious example of something that's been doing this, taking atomic components and combining them from the bottom up in all kinds of ways to create complex things of sublime beauty, well, the internet, right? I mean, the internet has the most simple components and had the most simple foundations. But of course, it's the ways in which it's interconnected that it has built such a system of value for all of us globally. It's the same thing with what Kate Raworth says very frequently about building an economy that is both regenerative and distributive. This is, I believe, also what she means by distributive. And she also, I'm not sure if you've seen some talks of hers, but she also has this little toy, the Hoberman sphere. She, has this little thing, and then she pulls it out, to sort of show how everything is interconnected. You can see it here in the picture. This is exactly illustrating this principle of interconnection and decentralization, as well as implementing these economies precisely from the bottom up. So, but what else can we apply these things to? I mentioned earlier in a previous class that we shouldn't have our blinders on too much with the Sustainable Development Goals. But now I'm gonna come back a little bit on this one. If we were to revisit the Sustainable Development Goals, we can start to apply these principles of integrity by design in building supply chains from the bottom up. We can start applying these to some of the technological solutions that can solve today's most urgent climate challenges. There's a book called Drawdown by Paul Hawken that lists the 100 most effective ways of reclaiming carbon from our atmosphere. And basically with all 100 of the solutions in this book, the technologies already exist. They've already been developed, the technology is there, but the problem is that they have some kind of a chicken-egg problem with the business model in which they just don't have the capital required, or so they think, to be able to make the upfront investment to be able to deploy the solutions, which then would enable them to return their investment later on. It's the same thing with things like windmills, right? So if you consider onshore windmills, which I believe is the #1 most effective way of reclaiming carbon, the problem with the windmill is that you need, the hypothesis is you need the upfront capital to implement the windmill. But once the windmill is in place, it will generate energy, and then you can sell that energy to be able to pay, for the windmill. But of course, the problem is, you have to get from here to there, right? And if you don't have the initial capital, then how are you supposed to create the windmill in order to be able to have the energy to be able to sell it? Again, chicken-egg problem. But, is there a way that we can tackle this differently? If you were to consider this case of these onshore windmills, can we take these windmills, these turbines, and can we break them down into smaller pieces, right? I mean, what is a wind turbine? I mean, it's probably steel and probably some metal cables and some magnets and carbon fiber for the blades, right? Okay, probably trying to create an entire turbine is really ambitious. But could we actually take just one part of that turbine and then focusing on being able to create a non-extractive business just to focus on producing that subset of the turbine? Like take, for example, the blades of the turbine, Are we actually able to produce more blades for the turbine? Maybe it could be that this is an easier challenge to tackle. So if we're trying to create a non-extractive company for creating turbine blades, I mean, what that would mean is that there's no extraction from the company, which means you have 100% reinvestment in creating these blades, which means you can pump them out faster, right? And basically the turbines everyone is creating is going to need these blades. So the point is that by focusing on just this subset of the problem, are there other ways that you can sort of speed this up? I mean, are there other products that use carbon fiber? I mean, maybe things like bicycles, or is there any overcapacity at those factories? Can you maybe partner with some of those factories to see if they can also, when they're not producing bicycle frames, be able to produce turbine blades? The point that I'm making is there's lateral thinking that we can do to try and break down the problem and see ways in which we can simplify things so we can get started with less capital. But it's not the most obvious way to do things, but this kind of lateral thinking is a skill that we can cultivate. So in the end, I think that, we really need to start asking ourselves the question of whether or not the problems we need to solve to fix society today, are these actually technology problems, or are they business model problems? Because we're taught very frequently that technology is going to save us, right? I mean, if we have some kind of social or environmental problem, we just don't have the technology that we need yet. We just need to, develop that technology, and somehow that's going to make everything better, right? But I believe it was Douglas Rushkoff who said that the problems created by technology are not always best solved by technology, right? So we need to sometimes stop being blinded by how beautiful and shiny and wonderful technology is. It's really easy for us to fall in love with technology. And I'm a computer scientist, so trust me, I know. But what if I were to hypothesize that maybe we have all the technology we need right now? And maybe the real innovations that we need to address the largest challenges of our time might be business model problems. So, this is why I think it's very important to cultivate, the skill of really thinking more about how to address these challenging business models rather than just always focusing on the technology. Okay? So, I'm going to continue now also with talking about the macro level, so basically the macroeconomic level of building a post-growth economy. And I'm going to start with the topic of governments. So governments can be conservative. Of course, Tim Jackson just put quite eloquently in his presentation about the amount of pushback and the reluctance that he's encountered from governments to embrace the whole concept of prosperity without growth, right? But what if governments could benefit a lot from embracing a more post-growth mindset? See, the way that things are being done right now is suboptimal. And also the Silicon Valley model of business incubation, the whole capital scale exit system that we're used to, this isn't always in the best interests of governments or its citizenry either. Now, there's an economist whose name is Mariana Mazucatto. She is an University College London economist, and she wrote several books, including one that is called The Entrepreneurial State. Her hypothesis is that the government is the world's largest VC, right? But the problem here is that we are socializing the costs of innovation, but we are privatizing the benefits. You can see this happening all the time. Take things like pharmaceutical development. Even things like fundamental research in the universities. There's massive amounts of taxpayer money going into funding all that research that's done in academic laboratories, right? If the university at a certain point wants to take that innovation that was taxpayer funded and they want to put it out into the market, they typically start a valorization trajectory in which they will typically get the academic, they're going to basically bring them to the Technology Transfer Office, the TTO. Now, when dealing with the TTO as an academic, this is roughly how it goes. First, the TTO is going to ask you to patent everything that moves. And the second thing that will happen is they will send you through to the academic incubator. And then that incubator is going to probably send you to some kind of startup boot camp where they're going to tell you that they need to introduce you to some venture capitalists. And by the way, here's a exponential curve. This is what you need to do. And by the way, exiting the company is also a large part of the objective. Now, the problem with this, of course, patenting taxpayer-funded innovations is actually, I believe, ridiculous because basically what's happening is you're putting a barrier for entry from other people actually using that innovation that the taxpayers created. It makes no sense at all. On top of that, with bringing in a VC, what's happening is that for a relatively small capital injection compared to the huge upfront investment that was made by the government and the taxpayers to develop that innovation in the first place, the VC is actually getting the majority or at least a considerable amount of the profit rights. Good deal for the VC, right? But it's not always a good deal for us. Of course, also with profit rights come voting rights and come control over what that innovation can be used for. So during the pandemic, of course, we're all quite familiar with vaccines that were developed. Of course, a lot of that initial vaccine development was also funded by government subsidies. Now, there was a startup that was spun off from the University of Leiden that was doing fundamental vaccine research. But in the process of that valorization, the usual thing happened. They got introduced to VCs. They grew exponentially, and they wound up getting acquired by the Americans, some party in the US. What happened is when the pandemic came along, that company from Leiden wound up being forced by basically its shareholders to serve the US market before serving the Dutch market. You know, this starts to lead us to ask the questions of, well, what are we doing, right? You know, because we're creating this entire ecosystem of innovation here that winds up through foreign investment supporting the interests of the entire rest of the world before it actually supports the interests of the local economy that stimulated it in the first place. We also don't think often enough about the governance problems that selling companies forms. Another example, also from my own industry in cybersecurity, there was a particular market leader in the Netherlands who was selling monitoring boxes for IT systems. It was all well and good. It was a considerably large company, and then they got acquired by a larger British company. The entire Dutch government and military and other sectors that were using these monitoring devices, they let out a collective, oh crap, our data is now going to the British. So what happened is a whole lot of the customers, they jumped ship, and then they moved over to a different startup that happened to be a spin-off of this original company, and they were also producing monitoring boxes. And then, the Dutch government and military, they thought, well, at least this new startup is a good homegrown Dutch company, right? And they started patronizing them instead. But of course, they were also VC funded, and they grew exponentially. And surprise, surprise, 2 years later, I read the press release. Congratulations to this other startup. They have just been acquired by the Romanians. Right. And we start asking ourselves the question of, when are we going to ever learn as a government? And at a certain point, the governments did start learning. And they've started incorporating the concept of golden shares in companies that are critical to the Dutch national infrastructure, including cybersecurity. So more recently, some security companies that have come after, if they expect to be able to procure to the Dutch government, they are required to put in a golden share that can block their sale abroad. But these are issues that we don't spend enough time thinking about. Another thing is that non-extractive companies are more likely to pay taxes, and actually give back to the local economy, whereas a lot of the larger corporations oftentimes are busy with tax avoidance or tax evasion. And the final thing also is remembering that actually unicorns are pension fund subsidized monopolies. And also monopolies are also stifling your own market's development, and that also is not what we're after. There's enough politicians, including political parties like the Dutch VVD, which is the business party of the Netherlands, and they are extremely anti-monopoly. So ironically enough, you might find that even across the different political parties, that there are different touch points that can serve with post-growth entrepreneurship. Again, the whole anti-monopoly aspect, and the market is broken, we need to fix it, appeals to the VVD. But you also have the whole concept of, remember, financial extraction, usury, remember Jesus and the moneylenders, that could very well be attractive to some of the Christian parties, right? You've also got GroenLinks and D66 and some of the other more progressive parties, Partij van de Dier, you probably don't need to convince those parties quite as much that post-growth is a good idea, because they're also interested generally in building a more social and equitable society. However, I think the real trick in this is trying to figure out how to take these concepts and translate them into different languages that will appeal to each of the different sides. Because I do believe at the end of the day, this isn't a political issue. This is a financial issue, this is an economic issue, and this is something that I do believe transcends party lines, right? So, and I think that a large part of learning how to promote post-growth entrepreneurship is learning how to speak these different languages, learning how to make these translations, and learning how to appeal to a broader range of people while not, pushing those away who ideologically might not always agree with you. Another topic that I would like to cover is global development. So things like international development. We spoke earlier about development projects and the IMF and how sometimes debt-based projects aren't the best thing. Post-growth entrepreneurship and non-extractive companies are extremely attractive also for developing countries. And the reason why is because foreign capital and the businesses that they establish create financial value for sure, but then they take that financial value and send it back out of the country again, right? If you're going to go stay at a Marriott in Kenya, then the point is that that money is going to the Marriott family, and it probably isn't optimally supporting the local ecosystem. That's different if you're going to stay perhaps at something like an Airbnb that's owned by a local person. So other things is that, this whole concept of extraction in developing economies has gotten out of hand. If you consider microfinance, extractive microfinance is absolutely terrible. The interest rates that some of these microfinance lenders ask for dwarfs anything that the kinds of Western commercial banks are asking for. And Muhammad Yunus, actually, who developed microfinance in the first place and non-extractive social business, he was furious, by these commercial microfinance institutions because this was not the intention. And we need to understand that bringing in extractive capital is another form of Western colonization. It's violent and it's destructive, and the best thing that we can do in trying to assist, with international development is to just teach the tools so that they can locally create their own companies, bootstrap them, and ensure that that value that's created can stay in the country. This is the best way that we can help countries with their development. And on top of that, the final sort of adding insult to injury is a lot of venture capitalists in these developing countries, including Africa. They bring also Western bias. It's really hard for African countries, from what I understand, to get VC funded without having at least one white co-founder. Totally wrong. So we need to understand that reforming the entrepreneurship we're bringing into these countries, that this is one of the best ways that we can also help with developing these parts of the world. There's also the concept of the UBI, the Universal Basic Income. And ironically enough, a bit of socialism is good for capitalism. Sounds a bit ironic, but of course, coming from a social capitalistic country like the Netherlands, it's precisely the fact that we do have socialized healthcare, that I knew when I was taking the entrepreneurial risk of starting Radically Open Security, starting my company. I knew if I failed, the Dutch government would catch me, right? So in a way, it really provides a support system for entrepreneurs that enable entrepreneurs to take the entrepreneurial risk to be able to start companies. A UBI, a universal basic income, is that form of a social safety net. I mean, what that is an unconditional payment to everybody, that's why it's unconditional, which provides a basic living wage. This could provide some people with the freedom to be able to pursue the kinds of jobs that they want, rather than just pursuing the jobs that they think they need to have to earn a certain income, right? Because it's also our feeling like we need to earn this living, even in jobs that might suck our souls away. I mean, this is what creates and maintains all of these so-called bullshit jobs, as David Graeber put it. And if we can remove that pressure from people, then perhaps they can do more meaningful work, including starting less extractive companies and social enterprises. You know, and in that sense, this is a virtuous cycle because, of course, the more you relieve that pressure, the more people can spend time on doing things that are more charitable and better for others, no longer feeling like they're in a position of scarcity themselves. And this is another concept that has really spanned party lines. From Martin Luther King to Milton Friedman to Pope Francis, a lot of people from different ideologies and political orientations have all stood behind the concept of universal basic income. But typically, of course, people then say, yeah, but how are you going to pay for this universal basic income? And this brings us to the whole concept of modern monetary theory, MMT. I don't want to go too deeply into it because I also covered it a bit in the first class when someone was asking me questions about it. But I mean, there was this whole idea about how, you know, the government is not like a household that has to balance the money coming in and out. It has this superpower of money creation. So the real point here is that with this power of MMT, the government is actually deciding what its priorities are, you know, because it can print money and it can buy all kinds of bonds and corporate debt when it wants to, you know. Actually, the deficit that's on the books doesn't matter because it knows that it always has the ability to be able to pay this off. However, it's more an act of political will in what we're actually going to be spending this money that we're creating on. We could use it for paying for a UBI. We can also use it for bailing out investment banks, right? You know, and the sad part is that the majority of the money creation that has happened has been used for things like propping up the stock market after it hit a major dip, such as right after the pandemic, you know, rather than actually being used to support the small guy, you know, and the average citizen. So, and this is, I think, really the area where we need to start paying attention and raising our voices. A lot of decisions beyond with politicians also lie by central banks. And the interesting thing about central banks is they're not explicitly democratic institutions, right? I mean, politicians do appoint the heads of the central bank, but it's not like we, the citizens, are actually directly voting for them. But it turns out that in many ways, the central banks actually have more power over our economies than even the presidents and prime ministers do. Because it's precisely with this power of money creation that they can basically decide how money is going to be distributed. So there's a term in economics that's called quantitative easing. It sounds a bit technical, but really what it is it's sort of part money printing, it's part financial asset purchases, and this is what I was talking before about bonds and corporate debt, and then also low interest rates, which basically means they can lend out money at close to zero interest. When you're doing this, what's happening is you are injecting money into the economy via a series of high-level banks who then take that money and decide how they want to invest it. And the thing is, when they get free money, this is when you start getting these overheated markets and everything and their cousin starts getting funded, whether it has a business model or not. And you know, we just had 10 years of this, right? I mean, economists use the term the everything bubble, because that's basically what described the years since the recession in 2007, 2008, if you remember the housing crisis, and the crash that came after that. In those 10 years, interest rates basically went down to zero, at a certain point below zero, and they printed money like there was no tomorrow. And the effect of this then is all of this money goes into this whole, again, capital scale exit system, plus the whole finance system with its fees, and this led to a really fat set of years for asset holders. And when I say asset holders, I mean people who own things. In other words, if you own stock in companies, that is an asset. And as those asset prices go up, you get richer. Same thing with people who own houses or other forms of real estate. As the real estate goes up, if you happen to have purchased that asset, that house, you are going to benefit along with the growth of the asset prices. The problem is if you don't own anything, and a lot of people don't own anything. A lot of people rent rather than buying their houses because it's all that they can afford. A lot of people don't own stocks, because they can't afford them, right? They're just trying to pay for their meals and to get by. The problem with this asset price inflation is that it leaves everyone else behind, And on top of that, all of this money printing creates inflation, the kind of inflation that we're seeing now with price inflation, which makes everyday goods like shopping at the Albert Heijn more expensive. And we're starting to see this now in our daily finances. So what's actually happening is, and inflation is a form of taxation. But it's one that there actually is no political discussion about. And what actually is happening is the money is getting taken away from those without assets and getting moved over to those with assets. This is the reason why, with the pandemic, unprecedented amounts of money were being printed. 16 trillion was printed since 2020 by the US Federal Reserve. How much of that went to people? Okay, a few people got a small stimulus check, small, right? But those billionaires, they were gaining $1.7 million for every $1 that was going to the average Joe. So really what happened is these billionaires in those 2 years where the asset prices were in a bubble, and this was a conscious choice. Anyhow, I'm going to, wrap up the class now, and I'm going to finish the rest of this content during the tutorial sessions on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. But thank you so much for coming.